Well, I think the average person who knows maybe a little bit about psychology or a little bit about Buddhism would think that the Buddhist emphasis or the Buddhist conversation about the ego is all about getting rid of the ego completely. There's this notion in Buddhist psychology of egolessness or no self. And most people misinterpret that, as Freud actually did. Most people misinterpret it to think that, oh, Buddhism is saying we don't need the ego at all, or we don't need the self at all, like get rid of it and then we're one with everything and that's it. And I think that's wrong. Obviously we need our egos. A good friend of mine, Robert Thurman, who's a professor of Buddhism at Columbia, professor of religion at Columbia, he had a Mongolian teacher in the 1960s who used to say to him about this topic of egolessness or selflessness, it's not that you're not real. Of course you're real. You know, you have a self. But people like you, secular people who don't really understand, think that they're really real. And what Buddhism is teaching is that belief in your own really realness is misguided. We take ourselves more seriously than we need to. The self is not as fixed as we would like to think. The ego is born out of fear and isolation. You know, it comes into being when self-consciousness first starts to come, when you're 2 or 3 years old, you know, and you start to realize, oh, there's a person in here, and you're kind of like trying to make sense of everything, who you are, who are those parents there. You know, the ego is a way of organizing oneself, and it comes from the intellect as the mind starts to click in. For many people, it stays in a kind of immature place where our thinking mind, our intellect, is defining for ourselves who we are, either taking all the negative feedback, like I'm not good enough, and the ego fastens onto all the negativity, or the positive, the affirmation, like, oh, I'm really something, you know. And the ego likes certainty, it likes security, it likes repetition. And so it's always reinforcing its own vision of itself. And that starts to restrict us, to confine us, to make us think that we know ourselves better than we actually do. So to bring Buddhism into therapy, or to bring Buddhism to a secular audience, it's all about starting to doubt the ego a little bit. Maybe you don't know yourself as much as you think you do. Maybe some of those fixed ideas that have been operating inside of you since you were a little kid, you know, and conditioning the way you interact with other people, with the world, maybe those are not all so right. Maybe you're not as really real as you think you are, and you could start to let go of some of that a little bit.